People, what is the most degrading thing you have ever done for money? I met a guy on Craigslist who offered me $100 for a back massage. When I arrived at his place, things quickly took a strange turn. Instead of just wanting a typical massage, he asked me to step all over his back, then his neck, and eventually his face. It felt odd, but he explained that he'd been seeing a massage therapist in another town who practiced these techniques, so I figured maybe it was a normal thing in that area. After that initial session, he contacted me again with an even stranger request. He offered me $500 if I do the same on his sausage and meatballs. At first, I hesitated, but the money was tempting, and he assured me it was all part of a specific routine he had developed. He had this special table he'd made just for the occasion, and as bizarre as it was, I agreed to go through with it. When I got there, things escalated even further. He had a very specific role-playing scenario in mind. The whole time, I was fully clothed, but he wanted me to pretend I was a giant goddess, towering over him and squashing him like a bug. It was extremely uncomfortable and downright strange, but I just followed through, trying to get it over with. The entire experience was surreal, and as the session went on, I couldn't shake the feeling of how out of place and unsettling it all was. Story 2. I was often the one giving money to others to do things they might find degrading. Myself and my 3 roommates/coworkers were pretty into betting on anything: board games, video games, drinking games, you name it. Every so often, I'd offer to pay someone to do something for my amusement. One time stands out. It was a night we were all home from work, having a few drinks, and I came up with the idea to offer my friend Tim $10 to complete the Icy Hot challenge. The rules were simple. He had to smear an entire tube of Icy Hot, one of the big ones, on his VIP area, both front and back, and leave it there for 10 minutes. If he could make it the full time, he'd get $10. If he couldn't, he wouldn't get paid. Tim made it about 25 seconds before he sprinted into the shower, screaming and crying in agony as he frantically tried to wash it off. Nothing seemed to help, and at one point, he was dragging himself across the tub like a dog on carpet, desperately trying to soothe the burn while sprinkling baby powder all over himself. Turns out, it was Gold Bond powder, but that was entirely unintentional on our part. At the time, I honestly thought it was one of the funniest things I had ever seen, but looking back, I realize it must have been incredibly degrading and painful for Tim. I didn't want to give him the $10 since he didn't finish the challenge, but when I saw how much pain he was in, I eventually caved and gave it to him anyway. Story 3. I once had an arrangement with an older man through a paid service. He offered me $1,000 for a meeting. I drove to his office, where I was told to be in my inners in a conference room and follow his instructions. The interaction lasted only a few minutes, with him briefly engaging in intimate activity. I saw this man twice, and each time, he paid me a little more for the same brief encounter. Afterward, he would always clean me up himself, as that was his preference. He'd then ask for a back scratch or a light massage while he shared details about his personal life. He mentioned that his wife, having gone through menopause, was no longer interested in intimacy. While I didn't ask for more details, I assumed the arrangement was happening without her knowledge or consent. After 2 visits, I moved to a different city and stopped working for the agency. However, the man reached out to me directly, offering to fly me out for more visits with all expenses paid. By then, I had started dating someone seriously and declined his offer. Looking back, I recognize how risky and naive the entire situation was. At the time, I was just 19 and didn't fully understand the implications of what I was getting into. Story 4. I worked as a life model for hen parties and also as a butler, engaging in a variety of activities that were both wild and degrading in equal measure. One of the more memorable moments involved doing press-ups with women taking turns sitting on my back. Another game, which I actually suggested, was Pin the Dong on the Butler. They blindfolded themselves and tried to stick a sticker on my apron over my dong instead of doing it on a poster, which was originally the plan. I also danced a bit, showing off moves I'd learned in pole dancing classes a few years prior, and danced and swung on poles in a pink party bus, much to the delight of middle-aged women, with me waving my dong around in their faces. Things got even wilder when a 70-year-old woman tasted whipped cream off my hand and tried to do her business on my dong, though I stopped her. After we got to London, I posed for pictures in just my boxers with the hen party by the embankment, which turned into a tourist attraction of sorts as random passers-by took photos of me opposite the London Eye. The highlight of the whole experience was posing with the bride-to-be, a stunning woman with a body worthy of a magazine cover, who was convinced to remove layers to her inners and sit on me. I also did some innerwear modeling for a gay fashion event, one of the pairs being see-through, and later, a picture of me in it was uploaded to Facebook for all my university friends to see. That's just a glimpse of the crazy things I've done. There's probably more, but that's all that springs to mind. Story 5. Before I became a full bear dancer, I got talked into something I really regret by my ex-friend. She convinced me to join her on a trip to Las Vegas for the weekend, where we'd work as working girls. The plan was simple. We'd hang out in bars, wait for rich, drunk men to approach us, and offer them our company for a price. I wasn't sure about it, but I went along with it because she made it sound easy, and the idea of making quick money was tempting. Thankfully, that weekend was pretty slow, and only one guy actually took us up on our offer of $500 an hour each. He took us to his hotel room, and we did what we came there to do for about 5 minutes. But then, the mood shifted. He opened a bottle of champagne and started talking about his life, his struggles, and how his family in another country didn't love him. It was honestly pretty depressing. He wasn't even focused on what he had paid us for. He just needed someone to listen to his problems. After about 20 minutes, we could tell he was really drunk, and it became clear that he wasn't keeping track of time, so we decided to cut it short. We left 20 minutes before our time was up, but he still paid us the full $1,000, no questions asked. At the time, I was happy with the money. It seemed like a quick, easy way to make cash, and I didn't think much about it. That was about 3 or 4 years ago, and now, looking back, it's honestly one of my biggest regrets. I don't think I fully understood the emotional toll of what I was doing at the time, and it's something that weighs on me now. That weekend was a momentary lapse in judgment, but it's one I wish I could erase. Story 6. I was completely broke when I was a student. I'm talking no money in the bank at all. When my friends invited me to a house party that weekend, I didn't even have enough for bus fare to get there, let alone for a pizza or some drinks. One of my mates, noticing my situation, offered to lend me 25 pounds, telling me I could pay them back when I got paid. I thought that sounded fine, so I agreed. Well, it turns out the place we were going to was a good 2 bus rides away, and there were no late-night student buses back into town, so I had to use the remaining 20 pounds to share a taxi ride back with one of my mates. The fare was about 30 pounds, leaving me with just 5 pounds for food and drinks. At the party, I was stuck with the bare minimum, so I bought the cheapest bottle of cider and 4 cans of cheap lager, figuring I'd just get drunk on that. When I got to the party and set my drinks down on the kitchen counter, a drunk girl knocked over the cans, and 2 of them exploded on the floor, spilling lukewarm beer everywhere. I couldn't catch a break. That's when my friends decided to host a fundraiser for me. Every time I completed a dare, they'd chip in a 1-pound coin. So, I ended up doing some ridiculous things throughout the night. I swapped t-shirts with one of the girls, who was wearing a tiny pink tank top. I'm 6 feet tall and weigh 18 stone, 250 pounds, so I looked absolutely ridiculous in it. I pulled out some chest hair and ate it, putting it in a bread bun for added flavor. I put on some lip gloss and had to refer to the guys as Sailor for an entire hour. I waxed my shins. I made a fake account on some adult fantasy RPG forum, then read out all the responses I got in the voice of Gandalf, wearing a green dressing gown and a clean mop as a beard while standing at the top of the stairs. It ended up being a fun night, but looking back, I definitely spent most of it letting myself out for 1 pound at a time. At least I had a laugh, even if it was at my own expense. Story 7. I dressed up as a furry mascot, got attacked by a deranged patient, and was saved by Big Al and Santa Claus. Definitely not worth the time and a half pay. So, a while back, I was an up-and-coming DJ at a classic rock radio station. I worked the night shift, making just enough to scrape by, but I absolutely loved the gig. The energy, the music, and the whole atmosphere of the station. It felt like home. Now, this station had a mascot, and one day, my boss asked me if I wanted to make some extra cash by stepping into the mascot suit for a while. I thought it would be a fun and easy way to make a little money on the side, so I agreed without much hesitation. Fast forward a few weeks, and here we were, Santa Claus, Big Al, the University of Alabama's mascot, and me in the radio station's mascot suit, on a holiday tour of a VA hospital, spreading some much-needed cheer. We were walking through the halls, waving and smiling at the patients, and it was going fine until we reached the psychiatric ward. Looking back, I should have known something was off when they unlocked a heavy metal gate, let us in, and then locked it behind us. But I was too caught up in the festive mood to think much of it. Big mistake. We went on with our little routine, miming and greeting the patients. But out of nowhere, a disturbed man jumped up from his bed and charged at me. Before I could react, he knocked me to the ground. Now, the mascot suit I was wearing was pretty padded, so it absorbed most of the blows, but the head was enormous, and that's what took the brunt of the attack. This guy started pounding away at the face of the suit, and I could feel the dents forming in the head and cheeks with each strike. It honestly felt like an eternity as I struggled to stay upright and protect myself. I couldn't see a thing, and the suit was so bulky that I had trouble moving or getting out of the situation. But just when I thought things couldn't get worse, Big Al and Santa Claus finally managed to pull the man off of me and get him away. I have no idea where the orderlies were at the time. There's a gap in my memory, and I'm not sure if they were too busy or just slow to react. Regardless, they eventually showed up and restored some kind of order. When it was all over, I was shaken but thankful to be in one piece. The suit had done its job of protecting me physically, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd narrowly escaped a real disaster. And that was the first and last time I've ever worn a mascot suit. Story 8. I was on the verge of entering into a sugar daddy-type relationship with a married man who wanted to pay me $5,000 a month for 2 meetings. That's $2,500 per hour, far above what I had ever imagined. We went to his car, where he inspected the goods. Honestly, I felt so uncomfortable afterward that I ended up drinking to cope. I should clarify that I consider myself sexually open-minded, so I don't have a problem with working girls in theory, but the thought of turning something I view as joyful and intimate into a transaction for work felt completely wrong to me. Later on, I started seeing another older, wealthier man who eventually became my fiancé. When he would give me cab fare after our dates, I would take public transit instead and use the money to buy soup for people who needed it. I did feel a bit conflicted because he donated to a cause I didn't agree with, but by then, I had a steady job and didn't need the money as much anymore. Story 9. When I worked as a bellman/valet at a high-end hotel, I had to pretend to like people, even though it felt fake. Businessmen, family men, drunk people. Everyone thought I was their best friend. I did everything for them, going out of my way on tasks, because that's what was expected. This hotel was over 130 years old and had this mystique to it, which made people act really pretentious toward the staff. We were always on stage, expected to be perfect at all times. The bell closet we used to change was hidden under some stairs, adding to the secretive vibe of the place. Drunk businessmen were the worst. They'd wave around at $20 and ask for ridiculous things, like, bring me a potted plant and something to water it with. I miss my wife's garden. Sure thing. I'd go sprinting to find them a plant and watering can for their $20. They'd then make snide comments about us doing our jobs. Just ask him to do anything for $5. Yeah, I will, but don't talk down to me. One guy would insult my haircut every time he saw me, then apologize and hand me a $20. I made about $140 off that guy. I got $100 for running to get an ashtray for a guy smoking a cigar. He was outside the restaurant, and the night manager tried to tell him to move. But instead of listening, the guy handed me $100 and asked for the ashtray, so I grabbed it. Sorry, Hutch, but my $100 came first. The Cougars were the worst. They'd call me to their room wearing just the hotel robe, leaving it wide open. They treated me like an object, not a person. They'd flirt, say lewd things, or parade around bare, then pat me on the back, give me $5, and do it all again an hour later. I forgot how dirty that job made me feel. Definitely need a shower now. Story 10. A suburban house party, the usual college kids with their parents away, drinking and causing a scene. Out of nowhere, a guy knocks on the door. No one recognizes him, but he says, I saw a bunch of cars, thought maybe you were having a party. They were about to send him packing when he pulls out a big bottle of vodka and says, I'll chug this for $50, thinking he'll pass out, and they can draw on him and steal the booze. The group gives him the $50. These kids were rich, preppy types from suburban Philadelphia. He chugs the vodka, then immediately starts puking. The mood shifts fast. He's been there less than 15 minutes, doesn't know anyone, and is now throwing up all over someone's parents' house. They get a bucket, and not-so-kind words are exchanged as he keeps puking. The group debates whether they should just kick him out, but since he'll probably drive, they grudgingly agree to let him stay. But no more booze for you. He still wants more booze. Getting obnoxious, he says, Okay, you jerks, for all the money you have, which ended up being around $240, I'll chug the bucket. He's talking about the barf bucket. The kids, as only they can, get excited and pool their money together. And he actually chugs the puke-filled bucket, while everyone watches in disgust. Then he starts vomiting his own puke back into the bucket. That's when almost everyone at the party starts throwing up too. The hardest $300 anyone's ever earned. Story 11. I started working a side job for a friend who had an online business. He seemed like someone I could trust, and I thought it would be a good opportunity to make some extra money. I'd go over to his house for what he called training sessions, and he'd cook dinner for me. At first, everything seemed normal, but slowly, things started to feel uncomfortable. He'd pressure me into drinking more wine than I was okay with, even when I told him I didn't want any more. It was like he didn't care what I said or how I felt. Then, the training would stop, and things would take a different turn. He'd try to get me to go into his bedroom, and no matter how many times I tried to say no, he wouldn't listen. It became this constant push and pull, and I felt completely powerless. I wasn't sure what to do because I needed the money, and I didn't want to lose the job. The whole situation was messy, and I didn't know how to get out. I kept showing up, hoping it would get better, but the pattern didn't stop. Those training sessions went on for about 4 months, and somehow, I ended up working for him for a year and a half. The whole experience left me feeling drained, both emotionally and mentally, but I didn't feel like I had many other options at the time. Looking back, I realize how wrong it all was, but I didn't have the strength to walk away until much later. Story 12. Determined to make it in NYC in my mid-20s, I answered a classified ad for a personal assistant to an elderly disabled man. The directions led me to a 5-star hotel with a stunning view of Central Park. I called up to the apartment, or hotel room. It's hard to say when you're dealing with the ultra-wealthy, and was let in. As I walked into the multi-room suite, I couldn't help but notice the expensive snacks and high-end artwork scattered around. It hit me. My potential client was loaded. I sat there for about 10 minutes, not at all bored, just taking in my surroundings, when a servant rushed in and told me I needed to go back down to the lobby. Apparently, the woman who was supposed to interview me, a relative of my potential client, was furious that I'd come up to the room without waiting for her in the lobby. She hadn't made that clear when I called, so I guess it was just one of those things I was supposed to know. In that moment, I realized I was clearly out of my depth in a social world with rules I wasn't familiar with. When I finally met her in the lobby, the lady wasted no time in showing her displeasure. "And you come to job interviews dressed like this?" she sneered. I was wearing scrubs, since I worked as a nurse's aide at the time, and thought I was interviewing for a similar role. The interview didn't last long. Later that afternoon, I got a call from the woman. She apologized for wasting my time, then, without saying it outright, explained that her relative was looking for a subservient foreign woman he could verbally abuse when he was feeling down. Story 13. One night, my best friend came home from the bars, completely drunk and starving. His roommate, who wasn't me, was the only one who had food in the apartment. Naturally, my friend, feeling the hunger pangs, asked if he could have some of the frozen pizza. The roommate, being the kind of person who clearly enjoys a weird challenge, told him he could have it, but only if he snorted a shot glass of his pee. Now, my friend was drunk, hungry, and not exactly thinking clearly, so without hesitation, he went along with it. He actually snorted a shot glass of his roommate's pee. Yes, you heard that right. After he did it, he immediately puked. But the promise of that pizza was enough to get him to pull himself together. So he put the pizza in the oven, passed out, and hoped he'd wake up to a nice meal. When he finally did wake up, he was met with the tragic sight of a completely charred, black, uneaten pizza. It was burned beyond recognition. So, in the end, he had gone through all that for nothing. The pizza was ruined, and he got absolutely nothing out of it except a stomach full of regret, and maybe a little less dignity. Now, I'm not sure this really counts as payment since it wasn't money, but I'll never get a better opportunity to tell this story. It's one of those things that's just too wild to leave out of any conversation. Story 14. In high school, one of my friends had this idea to carry around a water bottle all day, spitting in it to cut weight for his wrestling meet that night. By the end of the day, the bottle was about 2/3 full, and as you can imagine, people started getting pretty grossed out by him lugging it around. It was definitely turning some heads, and not in a good way. Just before he was about to throw it away, someone came up with the idea to pool money together to pay someone to drink it. At first, I wasn't serious about it, but I said, "I'll do it if you get $50. I honestly didn't think they'd manage to raise that much, but to my surprise, everyone was more than willing to pitch in. Apparently, people really wanted to see someone drink a bottle nearly full of spit. I'll admit, I thought it'd be just a silly thing to do for a laugh, but looking back, I totally regret it. Yes, it was disgusting. Worse than I could have imagined. Yes, I ended up throwing up. No, I didn't drink the whole bottle. I barely made it through part of it. It was awful, and I definitely feel ashamed of myself for even considering it. It's one of those things that, in hindsight, I wish I just walked away from. Story 15. For some context, I'm a guy, and while this wasn't exactly degrading, it was pretty out there in terms of getting money for me. Back in college, I posed for a small art collective. The whole setup was professional, with incredibly talented artists, the works. One day, The guy who organized it asked if I'd be willing to pose unclothed for a different group at another studio. It was a bit of a leap, but I agreed. So, there I was, posing, all bare, next to this beautiful woman, in front of around 50 strangers. Surprisingly, it turned out to be an incredibly liberating experience. Once you've been bare in front of that many people, it's like nothing else can really faze you after that. Edit. And just to address the weird questions, no, I did not get a stiffy. When you're standing without anything on in front of a bunch of strangers, trust me, you're not randomly getting a stiffy. It's not like that awkward middle school moment where you're giving a class presentation and your waistband is hiding an embarrassing situation. When you're in a room full of people staring at your body, the last thing that's happening is blood rushing to your dong. Believe me, there are much more important things you'll be thinking about in that moment. Story 16. One time, I drank an entire paper cup full of Pizza Hut buffalo sauce for just $10. Honestly, it seemed like an easy challenge at the time. Just a little spicy sauce, right? But man, it turned out to be way worse than I anticipated. It burned going down, and my stomach started to feel like it was on fire almost immediately. I made it through, but I would never do it again. That was probably one of the worst decisions I've ever made. And then there was the time I chugged an entire bear bottle of honey for $30. I thought it would be easy, just a sweet, thick drink. But I quickly learned how wrong I was. The honey was so sticky and heavy that it felt like it was coating my insides, and after I finished, I felt completely sick. But the worst part was when I ended up puking it all back up. Let me tell you, puking honey is one of the most painful, disgusting experiences I've ever had. 7 out of 10 would not recommend to anyone. Story 17. A few years ago, I was walking down the street when some guy approached me with an offer I couldn't believe. My shoes were in awful condition, falling apart at the heels, holes in the soles, scuffed beyond recognition. I was looking rough myself, a skinny, strung-out mess, and probably didn't look like I had much to my name. But this guy looked at my shoes and said, "I'll give you 40 quid for your shoes." I collect shoes. Now, I was just a few steps away from my flat, so I stopped and stared at him for a moment. I mean, who the hell would want these shoes? Are you serious? I asked, not quite sure what to make of it. He nodded, almost solemnly, like it was some deep transaction. Without hesitation, I whipped off those shoes as fast as I could. I wasn't even wearing socks, just bare feet in the middle of the street, but he didn't bat an eye. He handed me 50 quid instead of 40, took my shoes, and walked away without saying a word. I just stood there for a second, a little dazed, before heading into my flat to put on another pair of shoes that were in even worse shape than the last ones. I went back out and spent that 50 quid on booze and a few other random things. To be honest, even if I hadn't been right down the street from my place, I probably would have done the same thing. I was broke as hell, and that 50 quid was a godsend. He most definitely screwed those shoes, and for 50 pounds, I sincerely hope he enjoyed it. Story 18. One night, I made the decision to get tazed for 150 pounds. Now, in my defense, I was pretty much already halfway to being drunk when I agreed to it. It seemed like a wild but harmless idea at the time. After all, 150 pounds for just a few seconds of pain? I figured I could handle it. But, of course, alcohol and poor decisions don't always mix well, and what seemed like a fun challenge quickly became a whole different story. So, there I was, standing ready to take the hit, and when they tazed me, the shock of it hit my body like a freight train. It wasn't just the pain. It was the sheer intensity of the electric shock coursing through me that made my legs buckle. To make matters worse, in that moment of pure agony, my body couldn't handle it, and I ended up pissing myself. Yep, I literally pissed myself while getting tazed. Afterwards, I just stood there, completely stunned, trying to process the fact that I had just humiliated myself for a quick 150 pounds. In hindsight, I definitely would have said no if I wasn't so drunk. But I guess it's a story I'll always have to look back on with a mix of regret and weird pride. The things we do for money, right? Story 19. I worked as a slot attendant at a casino for a while, and let me tell you, it was one of the most degrading jobs I've ever had. Almost every day, I was touched by random customers. Men who thought it was okay to take advantage of the situation because I was behind a machine, just doing my job. The worst part was that I didn't even get to keep my tips. We were expected to give them up, and that just added insult to injury. It was a toxic, uncomfortable environment where I was constantly disrespected, and the pay didn't come close to making up for the constant harassment. After a while, I decided to move on and took a job at another casino as a cage cashier. While it was still pretty degrading in its own way, at least I was out of arm's reach from the customers. I didn't have to deal with the same kind of physical harassment, and I finally got to keep my tips, which was a small win in an otherwise soul-sucking job. But even then, the work still felt dehumanizing. Dealing with impatient customers, constantly being watched, and just feeling like a cog in the machine. It was a bit of a relief not to be touched all the time, but that didn't mean the job was any less draining. Things took a turn for the worse when the casinos started pooling the tips. Suddenly, even the little control I had over my own earnings was taken away. After that, I couldn't justify staying in the industry anymore. The work environment was toxic, and I realized I wasn't going to get the respect I deserved in that field, no matter what position I held. So, I quit the casino industry altogether. It wasn't an easy decision, but it was the best one I made for my mental and emotional well-being. It's frustrating to think about how many people still work in environments like that, but I'm glad I got out when I did. Story 20. When I worked at a grocery store, I'd often eat peanut butter and jelly sandwiches during my breaks because it was cheap and filling. I'd buy all the ingredients, bread, peanut butter, and jelly, and just sit in the break room, casually stuffing down 3 or 4 sandwiches before getting back to work. One day, one of my coworkers saw me eating my usual stack of sandwiches and asked if I thought I could eat an entire loaf of them. I joked that I probably could, but I asked what he was willing to bet. He said if I could manage it, he'd buy me a whole loaf of bread, a jar of peanut butter, and a jar of jelly. I figured why not, so I agreed. I ended up finishing the entire loaf of sandwiches in a little under 30 minutes. By the end, though, I'll admit, I wasn't using nearly as much peanut butter and jelly. I was trying to stretch it out to make sure I could finish. When I finally stuffed the last bite in, I felt like walking at my normal pace would make my stomach explode. So instead, I walked around at half speed, taking it slow, just trying to survive. Looking back, I realized I did it mostly because I was a broke college kid and figured I'd save about $4 on a new jar of peanut butter and jelly. Still, despite the miserable aftermath, I didn't let this experience stop me from eating PB&J sandwiches on future breaks. Oh, and that night, I ended up taking the biggest, most brutal dump of my life. Story 21. When I was 17, I found myself in a pretty tough spot. I had just moved out of my parents' house, struggling to afford food and rent, and then I got laid off from my job. Desperate for money, I started going door to door, asking people if they needed their lawns raked. I got some strange looks like, why is a 17-year-old kid doing this? But I didn't let that stop me. Realizing I needed a more convincing approach, I made up a fake clipboard and created donation slips for multiple sclerosis. I told people I was raising funds and would rake their lawn in exchange for a $10 to $40 donation. To my surprise, people actually agreed to it, and I ended up raking a ton of lawns. Honestly, I didn't realize how hard raking lawns could be until I did it all day, but the money kept me going. The thing is, I never donated a single cent of the money I collected. I used it to cover my basic living expenses. And while I know that sounds shady, I don't feel guilty about it. I lost my mom and sister to MS, which was a big part of why I was in such a rough situation in the first place. So, I did what I had to do to survive. Story 22. Apparently, my teenage nephew is so desperate for Fortnite money that he actually resorted to stealing from me. And I'm not talking about something small, like a few bucks. I'm talking about items I actually cared about. This sweet little guy, who I've always trusted, got so wrapped up in the game that he took a pocket knife and a dugout from me. I couldn't believe it. These weren't high-value items, but combined, they probably amounted to $15 at most. And for what? A couple of skins in the game? It just doesn't add up. What's worse is that he risked our entire relationship for this. We've always been close, and I never thought he'd do something like this. To think that he'd let something as trivial as a few virtual items come between us is really hard to wrap my head around. It feels like he's so consumed by this addiction to Fortnite that he's lost sight of what really matters, family. I don't know if I can trust him the same way again. It's heartbreaking, honestly, and I'm struggling to understand how a game could mean more to him than the bond we've shared all these years. Story 23. Back in 2005, when I was a student, a friend of mine helped me get a one-day job collecting bottles at a bar right in the heart of Birmingham during Pride weekend. I really needed the money, so I took the job, but looking back, it was pretty degrading. The bar was packed with people caught up in high spirits and drugs, and unfortunately, that meant I was continually touched throughout the day. It wasn't fun, but I stuck it out because I needed the cash. I ended up working 14 hours straight for just 70 pounds, and then I had to go straight to my next bar job in the center of town. The truly frustrating part came later, though. While I was working my shift at the second bar, my car got towed. It was taken by one of those scam towing companies that put up tiny signs on some random patch of grass that no one notices. It cost me 160 pounds to get it back, and to make matters worse, I was late to my bar job because of it. So, by the end of that crazy 40-hour period, I'd worked the night before, the entire day, and the night shift again, which meant a total of 35 hours and 40 hours. I didn't even break even from all that effort. After all of that, I was left feeling exhausted, frustrated, and with very little to show for it. Story 24. When I was about 8 years old, I was trying to find a way to make some money at the cottage. My aunt, clearly not taking me too seriously, told me that if I was really that desperate, I could stir the dirty hole, meaning the outhouse. Not one to back down, I grabbed the longest down tree branch I could find. I stripped it of all the twigs and debris, and then used that 8-foot monstrosity to stir up the outhouse. It wasn't the most glamorous task, but I was determined. After I finished, I went to her expecting payment. She just laughed and said she couldn't believe I actually did it. No money, no recognition. So, in protest, I fished the branch out of the woods, walked it over, and left it on the hood of her car. That was my way of saying I wasn't going to forget the task, or her reaction anytime soon. Story 25. This might not quite fit the usual criteria, but it's definitely one of the most memorable offers I've ever gotten. It happened in high school. I got a text from a girl, and it was about as straightforward as it gets. No hidden messages, no teasing, no wink-wink, she literally said. If you bring me ice cream, I will give you a blowy. That was it. No guessing, no beating around the bush. Just a simple, direct offer. The plot thickens when I found out that 2 of my best friends also received the same exact offer from her that same night. So, in a bizarre twist, 3 guys are all presented with the same proposal. You'd think that one of us might have taken her up on it, but surprisingly, none of us did. She never got her ice cream. To answer any potential questions, I was living in a pretty strict household at the time, so sneaking out on a school night to make something like that happen would have been a huge hassle. It just wasn't practical. And to add some clarity, we had hooked up before, and even after this incident, so it wasn't like there was some kind of setup or trap. It was just one of those weird situations where things didn't play out the way you might expect, but it still makes for an amusing memory. Story 26. When I was 13, my brother had to do community service for some dumb, illegal thing he got caught up in. Of course, he didn't want to go, so he decided he was just going to skip it. My dad, not wanting him to get into more trouble, asked if I'd go in his place. No one really checked IDs or anything, they just expected a kid to show up, so it wasn't like anyone would notice. In exchange for taking his place, I negotiated for a new video game. The community service was 80 hours at a local park, which meant dealing with a bunch of grown men who treated me like garbage. They constantly talked down to me, calling me some stupid kid who messed up. I just gritted my teeth and kept my head down, counting the days until it was over. Finally, on my last day, after getting the necessary form signed off, I decided to let them have it. I told them how pathetic it was that they didn't even think to check who was actually doing the community service, and how they'd all been treating me like crap. One guy threatened to report me, but I countered with the fact that it would look even worse on them for not checking something as basic as ID. Then, I left. Nothing ever came of it. Edit. Yeah, I know it was bad parenting, but at the time, my brother was pretty much a mess, always getting into trouble. If memory serves, the game I got was Earthbound for the SNES. Definitely worth it. Edit 2. My brother eventually turned his life around. He went through a rough patch, but now he's married with kids, has a good job, and a nice house. He definitely got his act together. Edit 3. No, I don't still have that copy of Earthbound. The allure of trading it in at Funkoland was too strong for a kid who couldn't legally work. But don't worry, I did beat it before I traded it. Story 27. I did something when I was younger that I never expected to find myself doing. I was in a gay corn. The pay wasn't great. I only got $250 for the whole thing. But at the time, I was struggling financially and didn't really know how to say no when the opportunity came up. It was by far one of the most uncomfortable experiences of my life. The whole process felt surreal from start to finish. I remember feeling out of place and awkward, especially in front of the crew and the other actors. The physical discomfort wasn't just from the situation, but from how I was constantly second-guessing myself and the choices I was making. I had no idea what I was getting into, and honestly, looking back, I wish I had taken more time to consider the long-term impact before saying yes. The whole thing just felt rushed and impersonal. Nothing about it was enjoyable, and it left me feeling emotionally drained. I didn't even really know how to process what had just happened. I ended up walking away with that $250, but the memory stayed with me for much longer than I ever expected. Looking back now, I realize it was a mistake I made out of financial desperation. Story 28. When I was 19, I made a questionable decision while playing RuneScape. Someone I met online offered me 20 million gold coins in exchange for a picture of my rack. I knew it wasn't real money, but looking back, it still felt pretty degrading. At the time, I was caught up in the virtual world and the thrill of getting something valuable, even if it was just in the form of in-game currency. I ended up using the gold to level up my character and managed to hit 99 magic with it, which was a huge accomplishment in the game. Story 29. I used to work as a cook at a dance club, the kind of place where the kitchen was located right at the end of the bar, so you'd have to take customer orders yourself while still trying to manage the cooking. One night, this drunk, arrogant guy walks up to the bar and starts bragging about how much money he had. He asks for some deep-fried chicken tenders, which were about $10. The guy pulls out a $20 bill and flicks it my way, saying he could afford more. Then he pulls out another $20 and does the same thing, still boasting about his supposed wealth. He goes on like this, pulling out another $20, all the while acting like he was some big spender. So, I decided to make him the best damn chicken tenders he could get for his money. I went all out, making them perfect, just to match his cocky attitude. In the end, I kept the extra cash, but honestly, I felt pretty dirty about it for the rest of the night. It just didn't sit right with me, but hey, the money was good. Story 30. Back in 8th grade, there was a kid named Nick who was in a bunch of my classes. He was a short, overly trusting guy who would believe pretty much anything if it was said with authority. He also thought of himself as a bit of a tough guy, so when someone told him the best way to boost his reputation was to take down the tallest guy on campus, he decided to give it a shot. As luck would have it, I was the tallest guy Nick knew, but he wasn't exactly confident he could beat me. One day, he approached me and asked, "Hey, Max, do you want to make some money?" Nick and I had done a few business deals before, mostly involving beef jerky, so I didn't think much of it. "What do you need?" I asked. "I have to beat you up," Nick replied, "but you have to pretend to lose." "Wait, what? Why?" He looked around like he didn't want anyone to hear. "Some guys said I'd get more popular if I beat you up, but I don't really want to fight you. Why would that make you more popular?" I asked, still confused. "Can I just pretend to beat you up or not?" He snapped, clearly nervous. "I'll give you $10. I'd done dumber things for less, like when Nick paid me to kick a garbage can full of bees, so I reluctantly agreed. Nick wanted to stage a big fight scene, but I talked him into a simpler plan. He would walk up to me in front of his audience, punch me in the stomach, elbow me in the back when I doubled over, I'd fall, and then he'd kick me. I'd get up, chase him, and then collapse. That afternoon, we executed the plan. Everything went as we discussed, until I met Nick behind the gym to get my payment. "It didn't work," he moaned. "Everyone says I lost the fight. How does that make sense?" I asked. "I didn't even touch you." "Yeah, but you got up and chased me, and I ran away." His logic didn't really add up, but I didn't care enough to argue. "I did what we agreed on, so you owe me?" "No," he shot back. "The deal was for you to make me look tough, but now I look worse. Imagine how bad you'll look if you don't pay me," I said. At that moment, I meant to suggest I'd reveal the truth about the fight, but Nick took it as a physical threat. He quickly handed over the money, then asked if we could stage another fight soon. I told him the price would be higher next time, and that I'd need it up front. He must have thought my price was too high because we never had a rematch. Story 31. I met this girl at a bar one night. Honestly, I wasn't really attracted to her, but I was a little tipsy and drunkenly gave her my number. The next night, she texted me asking if I wanted to come over and hook up. I wasn't interested at all, so I told her I had some plans and wouldn't be able to make it. I thought that would be the end of it. But then, a little while later, she sent me a text that said, "I'll give you $10 if you come over and bang me right now." Immediately afterwards, I drove to Sonic, bought a watermelon slushie, and as I sat there thinking about the situation, I felt a deep sense of shame. I gave the rest of the money as a tip to the car hop because I was so damn ashamed of myself. Story 32. Something that your recruiter never tells you, and what they definitely don't show you in the TV commercials, is just how much time you'll spend picking up trash, scrubbing toilets, and doing other menial tasks as a young enlisted service member in the military. I remember being on a cold weather deployment, where the ground was frozen solid, and we couldn't dig a proper trench for a latrine. So, my platoon had to get creative and came up with a makeshift solution. We set up a wooden crate over a large metal pan. At the end of every day, that pan would be filled with urine and waste from several dozen Marines who had been eating MREs that were drenched in Tabasco sauce, which definitely didn't help the smell. We couldn't just leave the waste there, though. We had to burn it. Every day, One of the lower-ranking guys would be tasked with the job of disposing of the waste. They'd have to pour about a gallon of kerosene onto the mess, light it on fire, and then stir it to ensure that all the solid matter was gone, while trying to avoid inhaling the toxic fumes, of course. Story 33. Ate a double handful of fresh vomit for $127 and change at a wrestling competition. We were on the bus heading to a wrestling tournament, all of us trying to get ready for the weigh-in. Everyone was dehydrated, starving, and already gearing up for the competition, which started the following day. Weigh-in was scheduled for Tuesday, and the actual competition was set for Wednesday through Thursday. We were all trying to keep our energy up, knowing that food would come afterward. After the weigh-in, we all grabbed sports drinks to rehydrate, followed by the nearest buffet, Cece's Pizza. The place didn't stand a chance. What followed was a chaotic, post-apocalyptic scene as we descended on the pizza buffet like a swarm of locusts. Teenage boys were boasting about how much pizza they could eat, placing bets on who could eat the most, the fastest. It was a free-for-all. Now, I can't exactly pinpoint why I made the decision I did, but there I was, trying to come up with a way to make some extra cash. I had just blown my paycheck on an Xbox and Halo 2, and I really wanted to take Casey Robinson out that Friday. Yes, the Casey Robinson. If you'd seen her, you'd understand. That's when it hit me. I came up with this ridiculous, half-baked plan that started right there in the restaurant. I barely ate anything at all. Just one slice of pizza off someone else's plate and some water. Everyone was noticing. They kept asking me why I wasn't eating, and I just casually replied, "I'm saving room for dessert." They all gave me confused looks, considering the dessert bar was right over there, but I just nodded knowingly and gave a wink. No one questioned me further. Fast forward to an hour and a half later, and we're back on the bus. Half of the guys are green around the gills, and I watch as the second phase of my plan unfolds. Money starts changing hands, all of it going to Big Brian. He wasn't looking too great after devouring a significant portion of Cece's buffet. I moved over to him, concerned for his well-being, and began talking about how I'd seen people like him just before they started throwing up, describing the smell in detail. I even told him about a time I'd seen a dog eating someone's regurgitated food. As I finished my story, Brian suddenly became a fire hose of vomit, a mixture of pizza, root beer, and Dr. Pepper splattering everywhere. The bus fell silent, the sound of the engine fading as everyone stared at the mess. Then, my stomach growled so loud it felt like the whole bus could hear it. I noticed the disgusted looks passing between the guys near me. Breaking the silence, I spoke up, loud and clear. "Anyone dare me to eat it?" The bus erupted. Everyone started yelling and laughing, but then they quickly turned serious. Jason, the unofficial treasurer, began counting the growing pile of cash that was being tossed into the seat next to Big Brian. The bets were on, and soon enough, we had a total amount. It was $127 and change. I had to act fast. The coach, who had been silent until now, leaned over, tossed a $20 bill into the pile, and smiled. I started questioning my life choices in that moment, but I couldn't back out now. If I did, I'd never live it down. With one final glance at the pile of money, I grabbed 2 handfuls of the soggy, half-chewed mess that Big Brian had left behind. I held my breath and shoved it into my mouth, hoping to get through it as quickly as possible. I imagined it was just instant oatmeal with a weird root beer flavor. I started eating as fast as I could. Coach later told me that the entire bus recoiled in horror. As I continued, I leaned down to lick a bit of slop off my forearm, and that's when things really went south. One by one, people started throwing up. Some were hanging out the windows as we drove. Others couldn't keep it down and puked into their laps. It wasn't long before the entire bus reeked so badly that we had to take shifts to clean it. It took us 2 full days to get it cleaned, with everyone holding their noses as we went in and out of the bus. The smell was unbearable. And that, my friends, is the story of the wrestling tournament bus ride that I'll never forget. It wasn't worth the money, but Casey Robinson was. Story 34. When I was in the Marines, a couple of friends and I rented a house on the beach in southern North Carolina. One night, I was jogging along the beach and came across a group of people partying behind this massive mansion-like beach house. They were obviously wealthy, but they seemed cool, so I ended up befriending them. A week later, as we were leaving the beach house, the guy who owned the mansion, Jay, stopped by to say goodbye. It was a nice gesture, and he asked for my number. A few days later, he called and invited me to a party the following Saturday. I went, and as soon as I got there, they started handing me booze, which I gladly accepted. We were all hanging out when the guys began daring each other to do stupid things. I joined in, and soon the dares got crazier and crazier, to the point where no one wanted to do them anymore. That's when young, drunk me blurted out, "I'll do it for $100, which led to even wilder dares for more and more money. At the time, I didn't have much, and my cash had already gone home with me, so I was tempted. After a few dares, one guy said, "Jay was right, you'll do anything for money." That stung. I was too young to realize they weren't really my friends, but I quickly understood they had only invited me to entertain them. So, I decided to milk the situation for all it was worth. Eventually, they dared me to jump through a window. The money had gotten high enough that I couldn't turn it down. So, I wrapped myself in a heavy blanket and jumped through this huge picture window. That was enough for them, and I quietly snuck off with my money and a few bottles of their expensive booze. I ended up leaving with nearly $8,000. Jay called me the following week and invited me back, but I couldn't bring myself to go. As much as I wanted to, my pride wouldn't let me. Looking back now, I'm honestly so embarrassed about that whole situation. I never told anyone about it until now. Story 35. A while back, I made one of the dumbest decisions I've ever made for $1. I rubbed a grapefruit in my eye. Yeah, you read that right. Rubbed a damn grapefruit straight into my eyeball for $1. It hurt like absolute hell. The burning sensation was immediate and unbearable, and I remember just standing there for a moment, processing what I had just done. But hey, it was $1, and I guess that made it worth it at the time. I was wearing contacts at the time, and after the whole grapefruit incident, I tried to put my contact back in. Big mistake. The second I slid it into my eye, the pain hit again, even worse than before. It felt like the grapefruit had left some sort of citrus residue that made the whole thing burn all over again. It was like a 2-for-1 deal of misery. I wasn't broke at the time, I was just an attention seeker. I craved attention any way I could get it. So, I was socially bankrupt, I guess? Story 36. My dad was a drug addict, and because of that, he often surrounded us with his drug-addicted friends and dealers. I was only about 7 years old when one of his friends promised me a $20 bill if I cleaned out his refrigerator. At the time, I didn't think twice and agreed immediately, not even bothering to check out the fridge first. When I opened it, I was met with a disgusting sight. It was a box that was filthy, covered in mold, and swarming with bugs. Inside, there were potato bugs, maggots, and fuzzy black mold. Everything was soaked with spilled soda, making it even worse. The stench was unbearable, and I could feel the sense of danger, but no one gave me gloves or a mask. It was one of those situations where, if it happened today, it would definitely be considered child endangerment. But all I could think about was that $20, so I pushed through and started cleaning. I don't even know how long I was at it, scrubbing and scraping away at that horrifying mess, trying to get it as clean as possible. Eventually, my dad told me it was time to leave, and I thought, at least I would finally get paid for what I had done. But when I next saw my dad's friend, I reminded him of the promise. To my shock, he just laughed and said, "Oh right, I owe you $5. I'll bring it next time, kid." That moment stuck with me, and it was then I truly realized the kind of people my dad and his friends were. People who abuse drugs don't just hurt themselves, they hurt others too. Story 37. When I was 15, I was desperate for a job, so when I saw an ad from a company called Vector, one I'd never heard of, I decided to apply. The moment I hit submit on my application, like literally within 20 seconds, I got a call. It was someone from the company, and they were ready to offer me the job almost immediately, without any interview or questions, just straight to the point. As sketchy as that was, I didn't stop there. I continued listening, but when they mentioned that I would need to buy their product up front in order to sell it, I immediately started feeling uncomfortable. The idea of investing money in something I knew nothing about didn't sit right with me, but I didn't know how to back out politely. Instead of just saying, "No thanks," and hanging up, I panicked. I started talking, but halfway through the sentence, I pretended that the call dropped. They immediately called me back, so I answered, and once again, I pretended like my voice was cutting out. I hung up quickly. They called again, and this time, I didn't pick up. They called back a second time, and I just ignored it again. That number didn't stop calling. They rang me 3 times a day, every single day, for the next 2 weeks. I was too afraid to just tell them no and end the whole thing. As a 15-year-old, I had this irrational fear of confrontation, so instead of just saying no, I let myself be haunted by their endless calls. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they gave up. It was a weird, exhausting experience, but it taught me how important it is to speak up and be clear about my boundaries. Story 38. I've stolen from people. This was a long time ago, when I was much younger and lacked proper guidance in my life. At that time, I didn't fully understand the consequences of my actions. I took what I wanted, even though I knew it wasn't mine to take. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now, I see the weight of what I did. I know that most people are probably looking for a more exciting or entertaining story, but the truth is, stealing doesn't lead to anything good. It might feel easy in the moment, but deep down, it's a degradation of who you are. It doesn't just affect the person you steal from. It also strips away at your own integrity and self-respect. You might not realize it in the moment, or even for years down the road, but that kind of behavior eats away at you on a deeper level. It's not just a bad choice. It's an act that damages you, almost on a spiritual level. It diminishes your sense of who you want to be and the person you're striving to become. I saw a comment earlier about a guy having to burn waste in a military latrine. Yeah, it sucks. It's hard, dirty work. But honestly, it's nothing to be ashamed of. It's honest work, and it's part of doing your duty. There's no degradation in that. When you steal, though, you're degrading yourself and your character. That's the difference. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update.